Welcome to Jews on Film, the podcast where we look at films both old and new through our unique Jewish lens. I'm Harry Adensasser, and I'm your Jewish film podcaster.
My name is Daniel Zana. I'm a documentary filmmaker and a video editor, and I'm excited to welcome to our Three Timers Club, I think we're calling it, Harry, right?
Sounds
I
about
think
right.
this is our guest today is the Director of Arts and Ideas and Festivals at the Strom Jewish Community Center here in Seattle, Washington, Pamela Lavitt. Welcome back to Jews on Film.
Hi, guys. How are you? It's good to be back.
We're doing good. We're excited to have you back to discuss, the festival, some great picks from this year, and to, talk all about the Jewish film scene in 2026. Any high-level trends you're noticing in sort of in the submissions, the selections this year?
Interesting, good question. You know, we have a theme this year, and so the theme of the festival is Roots and Reels, and it is an extension of our year-round programming with authors, thought leaders, chefs, and that's what we do year-round at the Strom Jewish Community Center, is make these profound Jewish experiences accessible to everyone. Obviously, cinema and the film festival, I've been running for 21 of its 31 years. It's hard to believe, but Roots and Resilience is the theme. I mean, it is about how we continue to persist and thrive artistically, and think about how thought leaders, whether it's Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, who is, published an incredible book from Tacoma and is also in one of our films this year, The New Jew, is just an incredible thought leader for the community, and Sarah Hurwitz and others who are thinking about this, and how cinema is trying to still recover from what's happened in the last couple of years and lean into fostering deeper Jewish connection. And I think our series, not so much the trends, but what we wanted to put out front was how can you lean into the roots that will sustain the glorious Pacific Northwest tree that we are here in the Pacific Northwest area. So that's the themes. And then animation, as I'm hoping we'll get to, is something that is a trend that continues to be increasing in our festival. Especially, it started in the short films, and now it's really hit feature films writ large and can sometimes take over good portions of the narrative. And we just had such glorious animation this year that I really want to talk about that at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely get into that. And we can say this kind of upfront, and you'll have known this by the time you clicked on the episode, but we're going to be discussing the documentary film Among Neighbors that, though it actually, presents itself as a live action documentary, very quickly you start to realize that these flashback or kind of memory scenes are just so beautifully, transmitted through animation and through a very distinct style of animation. And then we also wanted to talk about the short film. You mentioned that there were short films that were animated, so the fully animated Butterfly or Papillon. I don't know how to pronounce it. Papillon, thank you very much. Which I actually was aware of because it was recently, just a couple of weeks ago, nominated for the Oscar for Best Animated Short. Regretfully didn't win, but I'm really excited to talk about both of these, and just I'm so interested in what you started talking about, the themes of the festival this year, about this kind of resilience and reaching back to our roots, because it's interesting, both of these films are telling Holocaust stories, are about older people kind of reaching back to, looking back on their lives and their early memories. And yet I didn't feel like it was so kind of caught in this old past. It really was about these people that in some way or another kind of pulled themselves through and survived through to today. And I actually felt more inspired than you generally would from, such a dark topic that was explored in both of these. So I'm really excited to talk about that in the context of our conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that in some ways, animation has been avoided for many years as a subject matter to illustrate something as banal as, the murder of people in the Holocaust. I think that there's been a sort of revival, obviously, since survivor stories. And also the fact is that filmmakers, creative people, like, the idea of just illustrating a story with talking heads and, B-roll of,
Right.
locations isn't really illustrating the story. And so many survivors, of course, preferred not to discuss painful memories, and those awful images, in live action documentaries can be very upsetting to viewers. So it's interesting how animation has kind of moved in as a way to be extremely effective in kind of distancing, but also making very palpable the pain and the experiences that you would otherwise see through photography or other more documentary mindsets. I also think there's some, this year's festival, also, we won't be talking about this film, but My Underground Mother, which unfortunately is not streaming right now, but Among Neighbors is streaming, and Yoav Potash was our guest at the festival, and we recorded his conversation. So if this airs before, people can catch it and listen to that conversation. He does talk a little bit about how he used animation, and I think at one point, finding the right animator is also super challenging. And I think that what kind of look you're going for, I think My Underground Mother, she was very clear. She did not want the sepia tone black and white version that Yoav
Yeah.
Potash chose in his
Right.
film. So she went more for a feminine pink illustration of women in the Holocaust. And so there's very specific things that are happening. I think in Butterfly as well,
Yeah.
the filmmaker, who is a painter, uh, amazingly saw animation more as a painterly experience, and that transitions of people and bodies were meant to be inchoate in some ways and hard to see those transitions. So there's a lot of different styles that are out there. I just think you can do magical realism in a strange way that you can't do illustrating Holocaust stories. And yet, I will say, just as a marker of this conversation, the history of animation and the Holocaust goes way back to 1958. So this is not a new trend. It just happens to be that there's 40 to 50 films in the last 10 to 15 years that are using animation almost, either short films completely, and some of them, two of them now, Butterfly and oh gosh, what is the pig film that I'm looking for, was nominated a couple of years ago, as well. So we're seeing this is definitely an uptick in how we tell the story of tragedy.
I think it's interesting. You were talking before about like process and animation as like a way to to convey certain stories or emotions and things like that. You know, when I first saw Among Neighbors, the immediate thought was, oh, this is similar in some ways to like Waltz with Bashir, where it's like
Mhm.
very much like a documentary story with Waltz with Bashir. For those who are not familiar, the filmmaker was having flashbacks of his time in the Israeli-Lebanon war, and from what I understand, they filmed the entire thing. They staged a lot of the stuff, and then they went back and animated. This was a long time ago that they made the movie, so the animation techniques have since improved considerably. But I think what the animation does in Among Neighbors now is it's a documentary film. Usually budgets are a little bit tight. You can go on location, but like how many empty fields are we going to show for B-roll? Like I think these flashbacks and these memories that people are having really come alive when you have the mother hugging the child and then the wings swoop out, and like you're not going to do that practically. You don't have a ton of money for CGI or recreation because I think once we see the animations a few times, it kind of like stylistically works for me. And I think it was executed super well, and the way that they kind of do flashbacks and reveals and things like that was very artfully done, and the way that the story was unwoven using this animation technique was really, really something special.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
mean, I'll just mark that Ari Folman's film that you were just talking about, Waltz with Bashir, also The Diary of Anne Frank animated, which just came out 3 years ago, which, by the way, the initial Diary of Anne Frank, which was a much more traditional animated feature, came out. It was actually produced in Japan in 1995.
Hmm.
It was a feature directed by Akinori Nakoeka, and that this more recent one, Ari Folman, took that illustration from the Academy Award nominated Waltz with Bashir. And actually, the next animated piece was A Diary of Anne Frank, which is
Oh,
really
okay.
interesting. And there have been a number of, actually animated features that have come out of the East. There was there was a Jewish Girl in Shanghai, which the film festival premiered a number of years ago, which is an interesting kind of childlike animated version of a survivor winding up in Shanghai. And it's two little kids on the street, a street urchin story, basically. So there's a really interesting twists and turns to the style of animation. I do think that Yoav Potash's film Among Neighbors, and I'll get into some other kind of the gnarly stuff around this film and the challenges that he's faced in getting this film aired on public TV in Poland, despite
Yeah.
how gorgeous it is.
Uh-huh.
But really what I believe he told me that he had almost 23 different animators that he at some
Wow.
point throughout this process was working with. So it's a kind of amazing. It looks completely fluid. The magical realism, I think it caught, we have a committee of amazing 20 volunteers that watched God knows how many films and review them. But this was the first film that we all went like, oh my gosh, this is just
Uh-huh.
transcendent. It is
Yeah.
taken this story into a completely other direction. But, despite all of the softening of a very harsh story, and just to mention it for the viewers and the people that are listening that haven't seen the film, Among Neighbors is about, in 1945,
There you go.
a number of survivors that wound up going back to their small town in Poland, and there was a commemorative dedication of a cemetery that Yoav Potash, as a filmmaker, went and learned a revelation that 5 of those people had been killed by their own Polish neighbors, defying the Polish kind of right-wing government's belief that most Poles are heroes and victims of the war, but actually they were as well, not just the Nazis and Germans, but were perpetrators. And finally, a survivor, an incredible woman in her 90s, unburdens herself, and the stories of her childhood and the friendship between these neighbors. And then, of course, she learns, big reveal, that there is a reunion in the film, but a lot of the relationship between her memory and the incorrect memories, which oral history and folklore and stories are illustrated as she remembers them, and then the animation changes to what really happened. So you
Right.
see both sides of the equation.
First of all, thank you for running us through the summary. For our longtime fans who are waiting for the IMDb summary, we're gonna skip it. That was much better
This will
and
do.
more detailed,
Yeah, for
exactly. And I
sure.
appreciate you catching everyone up, because I didn't want to interrupt our conversation. I want to keep us going, in this fascinating conversation about animation, and specifically highlight what you just said about the way that animation is used as this gorgeous tool for conveying memory, and one of the things, like you were mentioning, about how the animation changes. I mean, she understands that relationship. She thought someone was, this character's sister. It turns out it was the sister, or it was the daughter of someone
Rabbi's
else.
daughter.
And
Yeah, yeah,
this
yeah.
the rabbi's daughter. And there's this fascinating moment where she's kind of remembering, she's telling this story about this Weinberg family that, she remembered fondly, and she learns that it was actually the Goldstein family, because the filmmakers basically tracked down this Goldstein who has a near identical story, life story to what she's been conveying, just, from that same town, just with a different name. So I don't just think that the animation is such an effective tool at that kind of magical realism and that kind of twisting, which I definitely think it's effective at. But when you were talking about it as memory, I find it to be almost like counterintuitively, it feels more true than had we gotten the kind of stock version, the stock
Yeah.
footage version of the story, because there's something that when someone is telling you a story and they're kind of illustrating, these scenes that obviously could not have been filmed and another movie couldn't have shown them. I was watching them, like, there's this fascinating with the with that Goldstein character, when he's telling his story and he's talking about, being kind of shoved away in this like crawl space above the door,
Oh, yeah.
and the way
Oh.
that he had to crawl out of there. And I'm
Mhm.
watching that and I'm saying, obviously our memories can fail us sometimes, and he's reflecting on things that happened, decades earlier. But I was just like, I feel like I'm witnessing the real emotions and the pain and the
I had the
experience that
same
he must have.
feeling,
And I was
Harry.
just like, yeah, and I was like, this is animated, so you might think like this isn't work. But for me, I'm just like, that this must have been what it was like. I feel like I've never actually encountered that in any Holocaust cinema, where I felt like I actually got a glimpse into, that raw survival in the
Yeah.
way that it must have happened. And I just found that to be almost more compelling than another type of kind of Holocaust documentary that I've seen in the past.
It's such an effective tool to kind of, because you're hearing the real words as it happened from somebody who was actually there, and you're not watching an actor perform lines from a script that is sort of based on truth. Like that's usually the way that it works with these Holocaust movies, like a Schindler's List or a Grey Zone. It's like Liam Neeson playing Oscar Schindler based on a book written out into a script. This is like the person to whom it happened, and he is telling it to the documentary filmmaker. And then they are taking sort of creative liberties to animate this, but they're telling such a good job. They're doing such a good job of like animating it and painting the picture quite literally of like, what did the hall look like where he was, in that sort of orphanage area, and then the beds disappearing because everyone moved to, and just the way that they're able to do so much creatively to kind of like heighten the story to get to the heart of like what they're feeling, I thought was like so effective. And, I really did feel like I was there.
The animation has the ability. Look, we have to look at the other side of the coin here, which is that documentation, show a history, doesn't necessarily prove to anyone that it happened. Like, unfortunately, denial is a reality,
Mm.
and so if you can affect people on an emotional, poetic, subtle, abstract level, almost, it is evocative of certain kinds of emotions of identification and identity. Whereas I think survivor stories can seem, oh, that, oh, learning the Holocaust again. There's a bit of we're inured to some of that history, and this
Mm-hmm.
has the ability to be more transformational. Obviously, cinema in general does that, but how you manage to kind of offer reality as the furthest distance from reality that you can get, whether it's emotional realism, these graphic styles. There are some, like I think about, there is another film that we showed at the festival, My Father's Secrets in 2023, which is a French-Belgian film directed by Vera Belmont. And that is a traditional graphic novel, almost Simpson-like version of a very
Mm-hmm.
heart-rendering, deeply uplifting tale of a father's, spirit, and how he contains his trauma, and still is an incredible father. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. The
Yeah.
question really is like, who are these films for, and how is it that they're
Mm.
broadening their audience? Because some of these Holocaust narratives will wind up, sure, you'll have certain ones that will make their way zone of interest. There's certain films that'll find their way into the public eye. You just had recently, Russell Crowe playing in Nuremberg. There are a
Right.
couple of films that are going to hit this, but the fact that Letter to a Pig, Butterfly, these very small films, these brushstrokes are just making their way through this very rich texture of our own experiences. That canvas is now broadened, I think, through these animated films. I think in ways that these dramas will come and go.
Mm.
Yeah.
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 Do you think that these like techniques are not intentionally, but like as a byproduct of their form, are able to appeal to a wider crowd or a different crowd who are more like visually inclined, like like people maybe who are used to reading graphic novels as like readers, like young readers or things like that, instead of these sort of dramatic films that are.
A couple things. As filmmakers yourself, you know that there's an element of when the untold is untold, it's not that dramatic. And
Mhm.
so um, there is an element of animation bringing the drama and the untolds into the ideas into it. The big thought bubbles show up as visual activity. And I do think that the graphic novel world, perhaps, somebody hears magical realism with Yoav Potash's film and might come and see that film thinking,
Mhm.
I love magical realism. I think that it does open it up a little bit more. The Elie Wiesel film that we're showing also, Soul on Fire, which is also aired on PBS, also has a huge amount of animation in it. It just feels like we date back to Big Sonia, and I think about Big Sonia has gone into the schools, and if it were just a Holocaust survivor story, I don't know how much, but, Leah Warshawski, I served on the For Culture, finishing funds, for that year, and the number of people that were looking for finishing funds, including Leah, for animation had really was really there was an uptick in that, and we're seeing
Mhm.
it. Demon Box was a short film that won our Audience Choice Award a couple of years ago. I mean, I just want to mark out that Warren Etheridge has been curating our shorts and has a real, love of animated. But Demon Box by Sean Weinstein also illustrating in crazy, crazy it's an I just have to say go see this film, but I think
Mhm.
he tried for so long to get this film out there, but it is about Holocaust and drama and his grandfather and this relationship, but it's going to great lengths to make that trauma some other kind of story. And I think there's so many films that are in my head right now. I think about also a queer story from last year, Maurice's Bar, a French film. Um, one of the most gorgeous, to take a fox that morphs into a glass that morphs into blood on the floor. I mean, those kind of things are just make those films more emotional and intriguing for a broader audience, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
I'm happy you mentioned that. I mean, I wanted to talk I think we've covered a little bit of Among Neighbors. I wanted to talk briefly about Butterfly, and you just alluded to it. But I think of the two, even though Among Neighbors has its moments, like you were mentioning, Daniel, earlier, with the wings kind of caressing, protecting everyone, and you kind of have these transitions. I think in part because of its, painted style, but really intentionally, I think Butterfly is incredibly abstract, incredibly fluid. Fluid meaning kind of in the watery motifs that it
Right.
evokes. Butterfly, for those who haven't seen it, and I definitely encourage you to check it out. It's on YouTube. You can find it. It's about 15 minutes long, but it refers to this person who, this real life swimmer who was he swam the butterfly stroke, and that was kind of, and you kind of experience him, and of course there's other transitional and butterfly, I think, metaphorical layers to that we can even unpack, but you just see the way that he constantly, and I think the movie itself as it transitions is like sinking into a body of water, and that's kind of how you're moving from scene to scene, and that's how you're watching this person's story unfold. And I was thinking about what you said earlier, Daniel, just about like, do you think this, as a byproduct of the animation, is it's exposing itself to other audiences? And I certainly think that it allows you to do more translation. Like I think you're not
Mhm.
as reliant on familiarity with the language, and I think that there's so much that's evoked in this movie. One scene I wanted to call out, and then I'll hand it off to the two of you, is just this incredible moment where you start to see, as his swimming career is progressing, he is kind of kicked off of the right before a race is about to begin. He's in Nazi
Right.
Germany, and he's basically, or in an anti an anti-Jewish a place, and basically he's told that he's not allowed to race, that a Jew is not allowed to race, and he's kind of kicked off. And there's this really, I think, poetic moment where the other racers, who have this sort of kinship with him, as a swimmer, as an athlete, and they kind of walk off with him. And there is a moment of kind of, like they do use language where they kind of, whisper to him something along the lines of, we're with you, we're sticking with you. But then there's this incredible transition where they kind of fall into the water and they become dolphins swimming around
Yeah.
him and
Oh,
like supporting him.
so
And it's
beautiful.
just it's so beautiful and so communicative. So I just think there was something so gorgeous about the animation there, and again rendering this sort of story of the Holocaust like I had never experienced before, like I never felt emotionally.
We had a funny moment too. I think about the film Flow, right? Obviously, with the,
Yeah.
no words at all in the entire animated film. We had an issue at first when Butterfly was sent to us. We didn't have the subtitles,
Oh wow.
Mm.
and captioning for independent film. So we were like, so we luckily had wound up with the correct one, but we realized that the film almost in its entirety could be watched without any
Oh, yeah.
captions at all.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's only a couple of phrases in French throughout the
Right.
film. And then at the end is simply the coda of this is the story, of this well-known North African French Jewish swimmer, told by his uncle, who was the swimming teacher of the filmmaker, actually.
Hmm.
So it is really interesting that the whole thing is just oil painting, and the moment when the dolphins do lift the swimmer up back to the surface after you feel that his life has ended, this very tragic moment. It is that those transitions, and the filmmaker has actually talked about it, about her water, and same with the film Flow, that animated feature, is how
Yeah.
water is just, I'm a swimmer, and so you usually, when you're swimming, just have one repetitive thought in your mind. It's this, mime, this source of life, but it is also, this retention of memory that you can't escape. You're just bathed in it. And
Hmm.
there's something about those two films that I think are related. And I will say that the film, while it didn't win the Oscar, I think did win the French César,
Really?
which
Yeah.
is the French Academy Award.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Florence Melee is probably butchering the French. My daughters are living in France right now, so they can
Ooh,
correct me.
nice.
But that story of water didn't really need a whole lot of language.
I will say, just to go back to your original point, Pamela, you were apologizing for mentioning so many films. And I feel like that is just, when you have the director of the Jewish Film Festival on the podcast, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into, that you're going to mention a lot of films. So we'll be sure to try to, we'll keep everybody educated, and we'll definitely put links to all the different,
Oh,
the
good. I'll
trailer,
send a list.
for the things, we'll put the links for Butterfly, and we'll put a trailer for Among Neighbors.
I would also just add that I didn't, which is a lot of, and I'm still conflicted, you guys, about whether people are flocking to these films at our festival. We continue to put them out in front of people. But we showed The Most Precious of Cargoes last year, which was premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 2024. For many people, it was their favorite film, whether it was on our committee. But I can't say that, and we could only show it in person, we couldn't show it virtually. It is absolutely incredible. But the audiences are not stepping into the animation fully yet
Hmm.
for the features. I'm not finding it. The short films, that is what a festival is about, is giving people these incredible short films. But I'm not sure I'm seeing our audiences stepping yet into embracing the animation that much.
Interesting. Yeah.
Mhm.
I wonder, maybe culturally, movie watching in general, how much of that is shifting to on demand at home stuff versus in
Mhm.
person. And most people, festivals aside, I'm just saying larger trends, as far as a Star Wars or a Marvel, people are flocking to the cinema for that. But unless there's a huge push from the cast or the crew, or there's a big marketing push for some of these indie films, it's kind of hard to get people to go out and do stuff. But I hope that's not the case going forward. I hope that there's a resurgence post-COVID, and people are more, interested in seeing and seeking out more independent films, going
Yeah.
forward.
We're seeing an uptick, no doubt. In the last couple of years, we've had a 10 to 20% increase in audience. In general, we were at our 30th anniversary last year. We were 3 weeks long, so there was a lot of film watching.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing the resurgence, or some of it. I still think our virtual offerings are necessary for accessibility,
Sure.
and sometimes for families with kids, put the kids to bed and watch your film. But we're still a little tentative on the animated offer. But even when Yoav Potash walked out on stage and introduced Among Neighbors, the first thing he said was, "Thank you. I know you all had to overcome the fact that this was a Holocaust film to get in the door."
Mm-hmm.
And, I get it. Jewish film festivals have been accused of being morose, moribund, so many dour subjects. It's funny that the short film We Should Eat, and we should eat, that's the joke, right? As
Right.
but I do think he had to first apologize for this, because it's that hump
Mm-hmm.
that you have to get over. And a lot of these animated films are Holocaust content connected
Mm-hmm.
as well. So in fact, all the ones that I just mentioned, every single one, from Big Sonia, which is a hoot of a film and an amazing story of an amazing survivor. And from her leopard skin outfit, to her big Cadillac with leopard skin print all over it. She's a character. It is a very non-traditional, and she's a storyteller in the schools, but animation keeps being used. We first have to get people in the theater,
Right.
for them to see the magic of what these filmmakers are doing.
I got one last thing, because I feel like something you're just mentioning, just about like different approaches to telling Holocaust stories. I think about movies like Eleanor the Great, which is, similarly, it's just a different avenue to approaching a story where she, assumes the identity of some, like her old roommate who was a Holocaust survivor. She took her stories, and there's a whole movie built around it. But I think that, and I think, this particular story, Among Neighbors, is not a story that I had heard before. So it's taking a very different angle than the sort of normal, again, not to sound morose or whatever, but like the Auschwitz stories or the Birken, like the bigger stories of the concentration camps and things like that, like telling sort of uniquely angled or different, whether it's like the format or the subject that itself, just trying to find a different way to approach it, I think is maybe, maybe a way to find a different audience and to get people into the seats. But
I mean, it just shows you, how hard this is, that we had to choose, 30 films, 6 of those are shorts, out of about 300 films. I would say a good third of the films are just Israeli films for a variety of different non-specifically Jewish subjects, fairly secular, not Quentin Tarantino imitations to horror films, very outside of the realm of the usual submissions we get sometimes. And then you have about a third of the films are Holocaust subject matter. And in a lot of people, it's almost a hard thing that you have to be so novel in getting those stories out, that there are successful approaches and non-successful approaches. Obviously, animation is an alternative to shooting a recreation or a scene with actors. And that tends to somehow fall completely flat, or it can be transcendent in itself. I think about like Blessed is the Memory, some of the work of, and I'm trying to remember her name, but that about Hannah Senesh, where reenactments work, and they can really work in the documentary format. But I think that it's about 50-50. If you have an incredible animator, I think you kind of hit it out of the park. But it's expensive. It's super expensive.
Yeah.
It's super expensive, and you really have to have mind meld with a creative person who sometimes may not speak your language. We had a collaboration 2 years ago about a small shtetl, and I'll try to remember the name of the film because it's a beautiful film, between a musician and an Israeli animator, and the two of them, he's Ukrainian, she's Israeli, and the two of them were, across borders animating his story. And I'll put that one on the list as well because it's also one of my favorites, and it's all in Yiddish.
I think these two movies were fantastic that we covered here today. I think it's such a great window into the way that animation is, being used to tell specifically these Holocaust stories, but even beyond. I think modern audiences, I think even popular audiences are shifting towards just new styles of animation, understanding it as an expressive tool. I think there's, I think of like Sony Pictures animation. There's been this like shift from, the kind of realistic kind of non-provocative style of Disney and Pixar that dominated for several decades, and now all of a sudden we're getting these Spider-Verse films that are looking like almost like pages of a comic book, and you have all these different kind of modern iterations on what animation can be. So I'm really excited about the state of animation. I'm really excited about the discussion we've had so far about how it is such a great tool for conveying the truth and the memory of these characters. And I think with that, I'll take us to a quick break, and then when we come back, we will talk through some of the categories when talking about these films. But sound good with everyone?
Sounds great.
Thumbs up.
All right, we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Jews on Film. We are here with Pamela Lavitt discussing Among Neighbors and Papillon. But first question in our categories section is, what is the most Jewish scene of this film?
Of Among Neighbors.
Yeah, let's go with Among Neighbors.
There's a scene in which the young boy who returns to his Polish town has moved to Israel, and his name is no longer what it was. It's now Yaakov. And the story of transformation by those who left Poland, where they were unwanted, they were taken to camps and created a new life in Israel, and then returned to explain who he was now. And to me, that is just the most Jewish moment in that film of survival, reconciliation with a neighbor who wanted so much to support him, and and his explanation of how he survived. That's my favorite moment of the film.
Wow.
Yeah,
Um,
horrible stuff.
I'm gonna
No
go
irony.
with like a complete 180 and go with like a very Jewish scene, but kind of a bummer. um, but just this whole notion around like the tombstones and like,
Mm.
so just for context, for those who have not seen the film, you know, there was a lot of Jewish cemeteries in this small Polish town, and the tombstones were knocked over and repurposed. So they interviewed a photographer who took these photos of all the different, and then they have this amazing montage, just like such a, you know, it really got my heart. Like, you know, you're seeing little pieces of a tombstone with Hebrew writing used as like pavement stones and parts of buildings and in sandboxes on playgrounds and as grindstones. And then they interview someone who just has a tombstone like as in his scrap backyard, just cause. Um, and so, you know, over the course of the film, we explore a little bit more about these tombstones, and then as like a nice button to this, you know, story, they're able to then take some of these shattered tombstones, and then once the new Jewish cemetery is dedicated, they are able to like sort of place them up on the wall of the Jewish cemetery. But I didn't know anything about this phenomenon. Hopefully, you know, wasn't, maybe it is a common thing, I'm not sure, but it was fascinating to me to learn about, and but really kind of a gut-wrenching kind of, you know, experience to see.
I'm just going to add something to this because Yoav Potash, when he was at our festival, shared with us that
Yeah.
scene, talked about it. And they had forgotten in the initial interview with this father son at their farm to do any B-roll. They just had straight interview
Ah.
with these two people. And they went back and they're like, knock, knock, knock. Oh, sorry. Can we just follow you through your garden? And,
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
and he's like, oh, hey, we plant tulips over there. And suddenly the cameraman is like, hey, look at what's over there on the ground. There's this tombstone lying there.
Wow.
And that led to a moment of like deep, almost banal denial about this. I bought it
Yes,
for
yeah.
25 cents and all my friends
Jeez.
have one. And that
They turn them
father's
into
son,
like
however,
millstones.
yeah, exactly. But that father's son, I think through that process, they, at the end, you don't know this in the film, and sorry, but you already revealed, but they do take these tombstones and they dedicate them to the Jewish cemetery. They were responsible for asking all of their friends that had similar stones, there were
Wow.
25 of them, to bring them back and rededicate them. So
I'm
that
getting
was
chills.
an unknown arc of the story that is
Yeah.
actually not in the film.
Wow.
And I was in Czechoslovakia and Prague this past December and visited some of the major, old city, and I can't even tell you the number of there's 9 layers of bodies in the cemetery, and they used it as a playground for a while when Jews couldn't go out into the street. Like, cemeteries may seem to be sacred places, but have so many crazy multi-layered historical usages, and those tombstones and that return is a part of the film that didn't make it in. So I'm glad you
Wow.
pointed it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank
Absolutely.
you for sharing that. I mean, this movie was so stunning, and there are so many kind of late, reveals almost feels cheap, but just like,
Right.
loops closed on the story that are just so beautiful. When you see the way that like, that father son, there's a moment where I think even he gets emotional towards
Oh,
the
yeah.
end, talking about like, not denying people their history and letting them have it. And that was so beautiful. And just like, the reunion, like we mentioned this already for the first one who's telling the story and then ultimately learns the truth of the story and gets to meet this person she speaks about having not seen in 80 years or whatever it is. And it's really, this
Mm.
movie was so beautiful.
You guys are, again, this is having the film festival director with a brain that just a million
Keep
other
it
films.
coming, please.
But I was so reminded of this film, and of course we lost the great Michel Verhoeven 2 years ago. He was known as the conscience of German cinema. His film Nasty Girl in 1995 was nominated for an Academy Award. He did a follow-up documentary called Human Failure, but it reminded me of Nasty Girl, which never got distribution in the United States. It had a theatrical. I showed it to like 300 film students on 35 millimeter back in the day. And he was here for it, but it's about someone in the town revealing something that the town doesn't want to know, has
Oh,
hidden,
okay.
has buried, and the shaming of this person. And luckily, that's the reverse of this film, right?
Yeah.
It's
Right. Yeah.
acceptance and not shaming by telling the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there was fear. And the only reason why, the woman who spoke up did was because someone had passed away that was supposedly responsible for the death of the 5 Jews that had come back to their town. So, it takes a long time for the arc of history and the arc of justice to run its course.
Right. Yeah. Harry, you
Yeah.
don't think you're getting off easy. You got to tell us
No,
your
I
most
will.
Jewish scene, you know?
Like we've all been saying, this is a very, very Jewish film. But one scene that really spoke to me, that honestly I just wanted to talk about, is this tragic sequence where right, our character Yaakov later is trapped in this crawl space and isn't permitted to leave. He mentions not seeing the sun for 2 years, and it's really awful.
Oh.
And like he's just so mistreated by this family that's ostensibly protecting him, but. There's this incredible moment where we have this beautiful sequence where he is given a book as a gift from one of the people in the family, and the movie the animation explodes because he talks about how he got a book every day and how that opened up his mind, and like all of a sudden there's this stunning sequence where he's becomes a character and these incredible fantasy stories and then these gladiator battles and all of these things, and just the way that it's so. Again, just the way that it's rendered, the movie I think swells to it in a way that's just both shocking and like really, effective and inspiring for this character who's in this miserable situation that they felt like he had some sort of escape. And most Jewish people of the book, I think the way that he was able to find a book that kind of spoke to him and opened up his world was really profound. But mostly just wanted to talk about that scene that was really beautiful. But let's transition now to the second category.
Sure.
And why don't we give our stretches of the pod? So as a reminder to our guests and to those who are listening for the first time or don't remember, stretch of the pod is a moment where we try to find something that likely wasn't intended to be Jewish for the filmmaker, or in this case, intended to be as referential or, connected, or however we want to take our stretch. And we try to introduce something extra Jewish, using our Yiddish cups, as you like to say, Daniel. So, does anyone have one?
I do like to say that, don't I, Harry?
Yeah. I've heard you say it before on the podcast.
Yeah. Let's see.
I can get us started while I'll give you a few extra minutes to think. This was,
a few extra minutes. How long is this going to take, Harry?
A few extra 30 seconds. Sometimes it's more difficult to read Jewishness into a movie that's so, Jewish.
Right.
One thing that really flacked me in another sequence that, again, I got, teary-eyed a couple times watching this movie, but when we have that kind of, rededication scene, of the cemetery towards the end, and there's this moment where these, Polish people bring out this sign from the ghetto, and it's the sign that says, no non-Jews allowed to come in, this area is only for Jews, kind of thing. And I think it's the filmmaker, I don't remember who, asks kind of very blatantly, like, you've held on to that, for so long, like, why did you hold on to that? And I have the quote written down here, but one of them replies, well, we know it's 70 years later, but we knew you would come back. And even just saying that again, it's emotional. It's so stunning.
Sure.
But 70 years and returning was very evocative to me of the time between the first and second Temple Mount, the first Beit Mikdash, and how it's destroyed, and how the Jews are kind of sent into a 70-year exile, and then in this very triumphant moment, they return and they come back after 70 years. And just this idea, the way that it was paralleled with this town of like, we knew you were exiled for 7 years, but we knew we'd see you back. And just it even puts like the story of the Beit Mikdash in context for me, where it's just like you could have people from that generation, people who left us children, can come back, towards the end of their lives and like, reclaim their past, be present for their youth. Like, again, just so beautiful and so emotional. So that's what it made me think of. That's my stretch this week.
I don't know, Daniel. I think there might be a mic drop on that.
Yeah. He's incredible. And like, kudos to you. Snaps, all around. I think.
Thank you. Kudos to the movie. But yeah.
I have like a stretch just about the the documentary format as like a medium of like storytelling. I think it's very much, you could call it Talmudic, or just the idea that there's like a main text, which is like the story of like what happened in history, and then you have all these different commentaries, you know, adding in flavor, a little bit of spice. You have the cartographer guy who's talking about the mass graves, and then you're having the politicians who are adding a little bit of context here, and then all these sort of character witnesses that are kind of adding to the main story and commenting on it. To me, is sort of, I think it could be in some ways Talmudic in that regard. So not quite a mic drop, Pamela, but I thought, I would try my best to
I like that with the
go.
layers.
Yeah, I just think that everybody adds like a new perspective, and I think similar with
And the
a lot of-
animation is like it's like the muscles, it's like we break for like a little bit of a story, a little
Yeah.
change it up.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess I would only say, like the Gloria Steinem said, like the truth will set you free, but it'll also piss you off.
Yeah.
And there's something about this film that has really pissed people off. And and so it's not necessarily in the film but this film has pissed off people, the version of the FCC in Poland,
Yeah.
It's also, even there's been, boycotts for Israeli funding for it in the United States by our own Hollywood, kind of outspoken folks. And so I think ultimately, maybe the most Jewish thing about it for me a little bit is that, you got to speak up even if you're going to be arguing a little bit. And I think that this film is in many ways an argument for the truth in times where people don't want to hear it. And,
Right.
and truth is really questionable. So the fact that it's hit a nerve and it's pissed people off means that the truth is coming forth. And I
Right.
think that's the most Jewish thing, is keep arguing.
That's so great.
This is great. I mean, this is like a perfect tee up for my next category, which is this film good for the Jews? And it sounds like I might have the answer, but I just want to take the temperature, Harry and Pamela, just in case, you have other answers. But is this film good for the Jews?
Should we go to Harry first as well?
Yeah, let's go to Harry.
I'll break it up. I can do it. I was thinking about this when you spoke earlier about, who are the audiences that are actually going to seek this out, and does this kind of layer story? And I think absolutely. And, I know we were talking about Papillon a little bit, and obviously, being Oscar nominated, there are Oscar nomination completists who definitely saw it and might have otherwise not sought it out. But even so, I think the way that these are communicating, like, they're not just telling a very kind of a Jewish story, but they're telling what is a familiar story in a way that I think adds, layers and meaning that you don't always get to see, that you don't always experience with the history. Like I mentioned to Daniel, both of these films, had an interesting perspective of a kind of righteous Gentile, or like a bystander to the story that, involved themselves. So I spoke about the kind of other swimmers and that dolphin sequence in Papillon. But then again, with this film, just the fact that it's centered on another character and on several other characters that are reflecting on their own relationship with the Jews and their own kind of recognition of the way that, governmental or other forces are kind of telling them how they're supposed to remember this past. And I just think that was very instructive and inspiring. And I just think as a film, I think for any audience is Jewish, it's important for Jews to see that, but also for people who aren't Jewish but are, interested in these stories, to kind of be empowered to be a part of these stories and to speak truth to what happened. So in that sense, I think these films are both, very good for the Jews.
Nice.
So important. All right. Well, you made me think about, I actually think it's good for the Jews, but in the wider context of what we're talking about is, the first animated film in 1958 was this film called We Shall Never Die by Yoram Gross. He was known as Australia's Walt Disney. And those images were barbed wire, broken eyeglasses, soldiers marching, images of prayer candles burning down, dolls lying on the ground, very, very dark symbolic hints of these Holocaust moments. I also think that there have been films in our festival that use Nazi propaganda footage without marking it and noting that where that film comes from. So we have these different impinging images that kind of come through in a lot of Holocaust subject documentaries or animated. And I'd say both the fact that this film avoids both of those
Mm-hmm.
is good for the Jews. That we've expanded the repertoire of images, of feelings.
Right.
And there's only one film in the festival this year that actually marked Holocaust propaganda as propaganda film while borrowing from it. So I would just say that giving us fresh eyes and retelling the story in new and novel ways keeps the story alive and keeps us remembering. And so it's good for the Jews.
I just love that as telling our story in our own words, that we've kind of reached a point, where we're able to, yeah, everything you just said about not using this other footage. I think that's really beautiful. Yeah. What about you, Daniel?
I think similar, I think we're in a similar boat here as far as just like using the format to tell a story in a new way, a much more specific story. We're not telling big stories, we're telling an experience of one diver's, through this like incredible painting style. And then we're telling a story of a small village, and we're not telling the whole story of the village, but really just this relationship between these two people in this sort of small village in a larger historical context, but it's like very narrow. And it allows us to connect to these people, because I feel like sometimes with larger stories, it's somewhat anonymous because there's just like so many, unfortunately, there's so many people dying, and it's just overwhelming. And like, where's my entry point here? And I feel like both because these are very specific stories and the styles are so unique and specific and approachable, I feel like this is, like everyone has said so far, it's a good way to attract new people, younger people, people who are not familiar with these stories, these tropes, and maybe it's not like grainy black and white footage, sepia toned photos with the Ken Burns effect. No offense, Ken Burns. I love you, Ken Burns, but it's 2026. People are approaching media in a very different way. So I for all those reasons, I would also wholeheartedly agree that these films, but more specifically, we're talking about Among Neighbors, is good for the Jews. So finally, we have reached the point that everyone in the podcast is waiting for. We want to know, how Jewish is this film on a scale of 1 to 5 Jewish stars? So whatever that means to you, maybe just we could call it your closing statement on this film, Among Neighbors by Yoav Potash.
I like that.
I'm going to give it 4. I think in some ways this film is an interfaith, intergroup dialogue film.
Yeah.
And it is not purely a Jewish film. It's
Love that.
really about the Kamzetzen, like come sit with us
Mhm.
with the discomfort of this story. And I think it invites in, I'm half Polish, Polish Catholics are this is one of the stories. Same with the film that we show, All God's Children. Our goal is to bring in the conversation within other groups that interface on a regular basis with the story of the Jewish people. And I think that this film is very Jewish, but there's one star that keeps it open for lots of other people to identify with it.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
like the
that was
perfect
such a
answer.
beautiful
I kind of want to steal
right.
that.
Like I love the way you like equip the stars as like leaving room open for
Right,
other people
right.
to kind of enjoy the story and make it about themselves, which I absolutely agree with. I think there's a lot of universalities with this story, both in the kind of survival and the way that the communities were complicit. But even towards the end, I mean, very explicitly, this movie is addressing these very dangerous and authoritarian laws about hiding, burying the past, and criminalizing the ability to even talk negatively about the truth of a situation. I mean, so many of the talking heads are historians, or there's someone who kind of was the curated like the Jewish Museum in Poland, and just was removed from his position because he fought back against this mandate not to speak ill of the behavior of the Polish citizenship during the Holocaust. So I think that is I agree with you, a story that many people need to hear, a very scary, modern story that obviously, it is so deeply rooted in our Jewish past. But I'll stick with you there. I'll give it a 4 as well. What do you think, Daniel? Where does this rank?
I think I'll probably go 4 stars as well. I probably, don't have as eloquent of an answer as both of you. But I think because like, half of the, I don't know, half of the relationship here that we're talking about is the Polish, witness and the Polish friend of Yaakov's, and then the entire town is Polish as well. So I think, in some ways it is a very Jewish film, but you know, a lot of the perpetrators of the violence, the witnesses, the survivors, all these things were non-Jews. So
Yeah.
yeah, for that
And I
reason,
think
I'll
it's
give it a
also
4.
why it it premiered on Polish television and then
Right.
create such a firestorm after. And also I will just say that, the museum in Warsaw, Poland, the Polin Museum, where the curator, this was during the right-wing nationalistic government that
Mhm.
this film was made in 2022, 2023.
Yep.
And that museum, was also founded and built, and that core exhibition around the same time. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what history will do with the backdrop of those that don't want stories like this to come out, and yet they're coming out of Poland.
Right.
So, yeah.
It's I feel like I saw in the credits too that this was done in collaboration with like some sort of Polish cultural organization as well. So they are, I think the right people in Poland are helping to promote this film and to get the word out about the story and the history that, some people would prefer
Yeah.
to stay kind of under wraps. But
Yeah, and our own Seattle Polish Film Festival was
that's what it was.
community
That
partner for the
right.
film, and they also make it really they spend time. They also have people on their committee who are Jewish, who really want to see Jewish films in their festival, and I think that's a great thing locally that makes these films have broader impact than just being in a Jewish film festival. So
Love it. Nice. Well, Pamela, thank you so much again for joining us on Jews on Film.
fun.
We'll get your third timers jacket. We'll
Is it
get that in the
velvet?
mail for you. Yeah, it's a velvet coat, of course.
You're the
100%.
first one, so you get to design it.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. But everyone should check out Among Neighbors, and should check out Papillon, and check out the rest of the screenings available on demand through the end of March. Is that right?
Yeah, through March 29th. But I want to say Butterfly is available online. And if you go
Yeah.
to the Jewish Film Institute in San Francisco, they have a great article about it, along with
Okay.
the ability to watch the film. It's an interview with the filmmaker. So people can continue to see that one. And short films will tend to get released online or on YouTube. Among Neighbors, we're hopeful that it'll have some kind of theatrical or television premiere, but for right now, through the 29th.
All right. Sounds great. Harry, anything to plug on your end? We're leading up to Passover. Any Pesach recipes you want to share before we cut out here? Sorry to put
I'm
you
a
on the
big fan
spot.
of I'm a big fan of Pesach pancakes. Sometimes even better than regular during the year ones, that like potato-y pancake flavor. So
Okay.
I hope everyone's enjoying those if they're listening to this on Pesach or before or after.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and thank you again, Pamela, for joining us. And I'll talk to you all soon.
Thank
Thanks.
you both. Sei gesund.
Bye bye.
Sei gesund.